Baby sneaked Mother Bear into Children's Hospital. What they did together put everyone in tears. The clock on the wall of Riverside Children's Hospital showed 2:47 a.m. when Jessica Brooks first noticed something was different about her usual rounds. She had been a night nurse here for 7 years, and she knew every creak of the old building, every shadow that danced across the polished floors when the moon filtered through the tall windows. But tonight, something felt changed in the air itself, like the moment before a gentle rain when the world holds its breath in anticipation. Jessica pushed her medication cart down the familiar corridor of the pediatric wing, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the linoleum. The children were all sleeping peacefully in their rooms, some with teddy bears clutched tight against their chests, others with nightlights casting warm glows across their faces. This was her favorite time of the shift, when the chaos of the day had settled into the quiet rhythm of healing sleep. She always took extra care during these late hours, checking on each child with the tenderness of someone who understood that hospitals could be scary places for little ones. As she approached room 314, where 8-year-old Ethan Marshall had been staying for the past 3 weeks, Jessica paused. Ethan had been one of her most challenging patients, not because of his medical condition, but because of his silence. The boy hadn't spoken a single word since arriving at the hospital after a car accident that had taken his parents. The doctors said there was nothing physically wrong with his vocal cords, but trauma had a way of stealing voices that medicine couldn't always restore. Jessica had tried everything she could think of to connect with him, bringing him books, puzzles, even a small keyboard, but Ethan remained locked in his world of silence. Tonight, however, she could hear something unusual coming from his room. It wasn't crying or calling out, which would have sent her rushing inside immediately. Instead, it was a soft murmuring sound, almost like conversation. Jessica's heart lifted with hope as she quickened her pace. Perhaps Ethan was finally ready to speak, maybe talking to himself or practicing words he'd been holding inside for weeks. She had seen children do this before, testing their voices in the safety of darkness before they felt brave enough to speak in daylight. But as Jessica reached the doorway and peered inside, her breath caught in her throat. What she saw made her question whether she was dreaming, or if the long night shift had finally made her imagination run wild. There, sitting beside Ethan's hospital bed, was what appeared to be a small bear cub, no bigger than a house cat, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the gentle light from the bedside lamp. The cub was positioned on its hind legs, one tiny paw resting on the edge of Ethan's mattress, and it was making soft huffing sounds that somehow seemed like responses to whatever Ethan was whispering. Jessica rubbed her eyes, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. But when she looked again, the scene remained unchanged. Ethan was sitting up in his hospital bed, his face more animated than she had seen it since his arrival. His lips were moving in quiet conversation with the small creature, and for the first time in weeks there was light in his eyes. The bear cub tilted its head as if listening intently to every word, occasionally making gentle sounds that seemed perfectly timed to Ethan's pauses. The rational part of Jessica's mind immediately began cataloging all the reasons this couldn't be happening. Hospital security was tight, especially in the children's wing. There were cameras, locked doors, and protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Wild animals simply didn't wander into hospitals, and certainly not into patient rooms on the 3rd floor. Yet here she was, witnessing something that defied every logical explanation she could construct. As she stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process what she was seeing, Jessica became aware of another presence in the hallway behind her. She turned slowly, half expecting to find a security guard or another nurse who could confirm that she wasn't losing her mind. Instead, she found herself face to face with an adult bear, massive and imposing, yet somehow radiating a calm energy that should have been impossible for such a powerful creature. The mother bear, for that's clearly what she was, stood perfectly still in the corridor. Her dark eyes met Jessica's with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth. There was no aggression in her posture, no threat in her presence. Instead, she seemed to be waiting, as if asking permission or seeking understanding. Her breathing was steady and quiet, and she made no move toward Jessica or the room where her cub sat with Ethan. Jessica's training told her to sound an alarm, to call security, to follow every protocol designed for emergency situations. But something deeper, some instinct that went beyond her professional education, whispered that this was not an emergency at all. This was something else entirely, something that required a different kind of response. The mother bear's eyes held a gentleness that spoke of maternal love and protective care, the same emotions Jessica recognized in the parents who kept vigil beside their children's hospital beds. Minutes passed in this strange standoff, nurse and bear studying each other in the dim hallway. Jessica found herself thinking about all the times she had wished for a miracle for her young patients, especially for children like Ethan who seemed lost in their own pain. She had prayed for breakthroughs, for moments of connection that could begin the healing process that medicine alone couldn't provide. Now, faced with something that couldn't be explained by medical textbooks or hospital procedures, she wondered if she was witnessing exactly the kind of miracle she had hoped for. The soft murmuring from Ethan's room continued, and Jessica realized that the boy was speaking more words in these few minutes than he had in the entire 3 weeks of his stay. Whatever was happening between him and the bear cub was unlocking something that all the therapy sessions and medical interventions had failed to reach. The child's voice, though still whisper-quiet, carried a liveliness that had been absent since the tragedy that brought him to the hospital. If you're finding this story as touching as we are, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Your support means everything to us, and it helps us continue sharing these incredible stories of hope and healing. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you never miss these heartwarming moments that remind us of the magic that still exists in our world. Jessica made a decision that went against every rule in the hospital handbook. Instead of calling for help or raising an alarm, she stepped quietly into the room. The mother bear remained in the hallway, a silent guardian watching over the gentle interaction between her cub and the human child. As Jessica moved closer to the bed, she could hear Ethan's words more clearly, and what she heard brought tears to her eyes. "I miss them so much," Ethan was whispering to the bear cub, his small hand gently stroking the creature's soft fur. "My mom used to read me stories about animals in the forest. She said they understood things that people sometimes forgot." The cub made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and nuzzled closer to Ethan's side. "Do you think they can see me from heaven? Do you think they know I'm trying to be brave?" The bear cub responded with gentle huffing sounds that seemed perfectly timed to offer comfort. It was as if the small creature understood not just Ethan's words, but the deep pain behind them. Jessica watched in amazement as the cub carefully positioned itself so that Ethan could lean against its warm, furry side. The boy's rigid posture, which had been his constant companion since the accident, began to relax for the first time since his arrival. "The nurses are nice here," Ethan continued, unaware that Jessica was listening from the shadows near the door. "Especially Miss Jessica. She brings me extra pudding sometimes and never makes me talk when I don't want to. But it's hard to talk when everything inside feels so heavy. Do you ever feel heavy inside?" The cub shifted slightly, pressing closer to Ethan as if offering its own form of therapy through simple presence and warmth. Jessica found herself holding her breath, afraid that any movement might break the spell of this extraordinary moment. She had worked with traumatized children long enough to recognize the significance of what was happening. Ethan was processing his grief, expressing emotions he had kept locked inside, all because a small bear cub had somehow found its way to his bedside and offered the kind of unconditional acceptance that only animals seemed capable of providing. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Ethan sharing memories of his parents, his fears about the future, and his struggle to find meaning in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. The bear cub listened to every word with the patience of a trained therapist, offering comfort through gentle sounds and careful positioning that allowed Ethan to feel safe and supported. Jessica realized she was witnessing a form of healing that no medical textbook had ever described. Yet it was more effective than any treatment they had attempted. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside Ethan's window, the bear cub began to show signs of restlessness. It gently extracted itself from Ethan's embrace and moved toward the doorway where its mother waited. Ethan's eyes followed the small creature with a mixture of sadness and understanding that seemed far beyond his 8 years. "You have to go back to your family now, don't you?" Ethan asked softly. The cub paused at the foot of the bed and looked back at him with dark eyes that seemed to convey a promise of return. "Will you come see me again? I have more stories I want to tell you about my mom and dad." The cub made one final soft sound before padding out of the room to rejoin its mother in the hallway. Jessica stepped forward as the bears disappeared around the corner, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. She approached Ethan's bed, expecting him to retreat back into his shell of silence now that his unusual visitor had departed. Instead, the boy looked up at her with eyes that held a spark of life she hadn't seen before. "Miss Jessica," Ethan said, his voice still quiet but clear and purposeful. "I think I'm ready to talk now. Really talk. About everything." Jessica felt tears spring to her eyes as she pulled up the chair beside his bed, the same chair where a small bear cub had just provided more healing than weeks of traditional therapy. "I'm here to listen, Ethan," Jessica replied, settling into the chair and giving him her full attention. "Take all the time you need." As she prepared to hear the words that Ethan had been holding inside for so long, Jessica couldn't help but glance toward the doorway where the bears had vanished. She had no explanation for what had just occurred, no way to make sense of how wild animals had somehow gained access to a secure hospital floor and provided exactly the kind of intervention that Ethan needed most. The rest of Jessica's shift passed in a blur of conversation and connection, as Ethan slowly began to unpack the trauma he had been carrying alone. He spoke about the night of the accident, about waking up in the hospital to learn that his parents were gone, about the crushing weight of silence that had seemed like his only protection against a world that no longer made sense. With each word, Jessica could see the burden lifting slightly from his small shoulders, as if the bear cub's visit had given him permission to begin the long journey toward healing. As the morning shift nurses began to arrive, Jessica found herself facing a dilemma. How could she possibly explain what she had witnessed? Who would believe that wild bears had somehow found their way into the hospital and provided therapeutic intervention to a traumatized child? The rational part of her mind suggested that she had been hallucinating, that the stress of her job and the long night shift had created an elaborate fantasy. But Ethan's transformation was real and undeniable. Something extraordinary had happened in room 314, something that had broken through weeks of silence and begun a healing process that traditional medicine had failed to achieve. Dr. Logan Carter arrived for his morning rounds earlier than usual, drawn by reports from the day shift that Ethan Marshall had experienced a breakthrough during the night. Jessica met him in the hallway outside Ethan's room, struggling with how much to share about the events she had witnessed. Logan was a good doctor, compassionate and open-minded, but even he might find the truth too incredible to accept. "Jessica, I hear our young patient had quite a night," Logan said, reviewing Ethan's chart on his tablet. "The day nurse mentioned that he's been talking, actually engaging in conversation. That's remarkable progress, considering where he was just yesterday." Logan's voice carried the excitement of a physician witnessing an unexpected recovery, the kind of breakthrough that reminded him why he had chosen pediatric medicine in the first place. "It was extraordinary, Doctor." "Carter," Jessica replied carefully, choosing her words with deliberate precision. "Something happened during the night that seemed to unlock whatever was keeping Ethan trapped in his silence. I've never seen anything quite like it in all my years of nursing." She paused, studying Logan's face for any sign of how he might react to a more detailed explanation. "Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places, doesn't it?" Logan nodded thoughtfully, his attention focused on the positive changes in Ethan's condition rather than the mysterious circumstances that had brought them about. The human mind, especially a child's mind, has remarkable resilience when given the right catalyst for recovery. Whatever happened last night, we should be grateful for it and build upon this progress. He looked toward Ethan's room with the satisfaction of a doctor seeing his patient take steps toward recovery. As Logan entered the room to conduct his morning examination, Jessica remained in the hallway, her mind still processing the incredible events of the night. She found herself looking toward the windows that lined the corridor, wondering where the bears had gone and whether they would return. The rationale, part of her mind insisted that she had somehow imagined the entire encounter, but her heart knew better. She had witnessed something that transcended the boundaries of normal experience, something that had brought healing in a way that medical science couldn't explain or replicate. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the floor, where just hours earlier a mother bear had stood guard while her cub provided comfort to a grieving child. Jessica realized that her understanding of healing, of the connections between all living beings, had been fundamentally changed by what she had witnessed. She had always believed that hospitals were places where science and compassion worked together to restore health, but now she understood that sometimes healing required something beyond human intervention, something that connected to the deeper rhythms of life itself. As she prepared to end her shift and head home, Jessica made a mental note to pay special attention to the security footage from the night. She needed to know if the cameras had captured any evidence of the bear's presence, or if the entire encounter had somehow occurred in a space beyond the reach of electronic surveillance. Part of her hoped for proof that would validate her experience, while another part feared that concrete evidence might somehow diminish the magic of what had occurred. The day shift was taking over, bringing with it the familiar bustle of hospital activity. Doctors making rounds, nurses administering medications, families arriving for visits, all the normal rhythms of a children's hospital focused on healing and hope. But Jessica carried with her the knowledge that healing sometimes came in forms that no medical textbook could predict or explain. As she walked toward the elevator, she glanced back one more time at room 314, where Ethan was now engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Carter, his voice growing stronger with each word. The elevator doors closed, but Jessica's mind remained focused on the mystery that had unfolded during her shift. She knew that she would return tonight with a heightened awareness, watching for signs that the bears might visit again. Something told her that the story was far from over, that what she had witnessed was just the beginning of something larger and more profound than a single night's encounter between a traumatized child and an unlikely source of comfort. Chapter 2. The Silent Bond. The next evening arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to settle over Riverside Children's Hospital like a gentle blanket. Jessica Brooks returned for her night shift with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, her mind still processing the extraordinary events of the previous evening. She had spent her day off researching everything she could find about bear behavior, animal therapy, and unexplained phenomena in medical settings. But nothing she read could adequately explain what she had witnessed in room 314. As she began her evening rounds, Jessica noticed that Ethan Marshall's transformation had continued throughout the day. The day shift nurses reported that he had eaten his first full meal since arriving at the hospital, had engaged in conversation with his physical therapist, and had even smiled when one of the younger nurses brought him a new coloring book. The change was so dramatic that Dr. Carter had ordered additional psychological evaluations to better understand the breakthrough and how to support Ethan's continued progress. Jessica made her way through the familiar corridors, checking on each child with her usual care and attention. Little Avery Johnson, in room 308, was recovering well from her appendectomy and would likely go home within the next few days. Michael Hayes, in room 312, was battling leukemia with the fierce determination of a 10-year-old warrior, and his latest test results showed encouraging signs of improvement. Each child represented a story of struggle and hope, but Jessica found her thoughts repeatedly returning to Ethan and the mysterious visitors who had somehow found their way to his bedside. As the clock approached the same time when she had first encountered the bears, Jessica positioned herself near the nurse's station with a clear view of the corridor leading to Ethan's room. She had decided that if the bears returned, she would be ready to observe their behavior more carefully, to try to understand how they had gained access to the hospital and what drew them specifically to Ethan. The rational part of her mind still questioned whether the entire encounter had been real, but the evidence of Ethan's remarkable recovery made it impossible to dismiss what she had witnessed. At exactly 2:30 a.m., Jessica heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway, but these weren't the familiar footsteps of hospital staff or security guards. They were quieter, more deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested careful navigation through unfamiliar territory. Jessica held her breath as she peered around the corner of the nurse's station, and her heart began to race as she saw the same two bears moving silently down the corridor toward Ethan's room. The mother bear led the way with the same calm dignity she had displayed the night before, while her cub followed close behind, occasionally pausing to sniff at interesting scents or to examine the strange environment of the hospital hallway. Jessica noticed details she had missed during their first encounter. The mother bear's fur showed signs of recent grooming, as if she had prepared for this visit with the same care a human might take when visiting someone important. The cub moved with growing confidence, as if the hospital was becoming familiar territory rather than a frightening unknown. What struck Jessica most profoundly was the purposefulness of their movement. These weren't lost animals wandering randomly through the building. They were visitors with a clear destination and intention. The mother bear paused outside several rooms, seeming to listen or sense something about the occupants, but she continued moving until she reached room 314. There, she settled into the same position she had occupied the night before, a silent guardian watching over her cub's interaction with the human child who had somehow become important to their family unit. Jessica crept closer, positioning herself where she could observe without interfering. Through the partially open door, she could see Ethan sitting up in his bed, his face bright with anticipation, as if he had been waiting for his unusual visitors to return. The bear cub entered the room with the confidence of a welcome guest, immediately moving to the familiar spot beside Ethan's bed where their previous conversation had taken place. "You came back," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "I wasn't sure if last night was real or if I dreamed it all. The cub responded with soft huffing sounds that seemed to convey reassurance and affection. "I've been thinking about what you said, well, what I think you said. Sometimes it feels like you understand things better than the grown-ups do." Jessica realized that Ethan was attributing meaning to the bear cub's vocalizations, creating a dialogue that existed somewhere between imagination and genuine interspecies communication. Whether the bears actually understood human speech was less important than the fact that Ethan felt heard and understood in their presence. The child had found a safe space to express his deepest thoughts and emotions, free from the well-meaning but sometimes overwhelming attention of medical professionals and concerned adults. "I told Dr. Carter about my parents today," Ethan continued, gently stroking the cub's fur as he spoke. "I told him about the last thing my mom said to me before we got in the car that night. She said she loved me more than all the stars in the sky, and that even if something ever happened to her and Dad, that love would always be with me." The cub nestled closer to Ethan, providing physical comfort as the boy processed these profound memories. Jessica felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to Ethan's words. She had worked with many traumatized children, but she had never witnessed such a pure and effective form of therapeutic communication. The bear cub offered something that human counselors, despite their training and good intentions, sometimes struggled to provide: complete acceptance without judgment, comfort without the need for words, and presence without the pressure to heal according to any predetermined timeline. "The scary part," Ethan whispered, his voice becoming even quieter, "is that sometimes I forget what they looked like. I try so hard to remember my mom's smile, or the way my dad laughed when he watched funny movies, but the pictures in my head keep getting fuzzy. What if I forget them completely?" The cub made gentle sounds. That seemed to offer reassurance, and Ethan's tense shoulders began to relax as he continued to pet the small creature. "But when you're here with me, it feels like they're closer somehow. Like maybe they sent you to help me remember that love doesn't disappear just because people do." Ethan paused, looking directly into the cub's dark eyes. "Do you think that's possible? Do you think people who love us can find ways to take care of us even after they're gone?" The profoundness of Ethan's question struck Jessica with unexpected force. Here was an 8-year-old child grappling with concepts that challenged even adult understanding. Yet he was finding his way toward healing through connection with a creature that couldn't offer conventional answers or explanations. The bear cub's response was to position itself so that Ethan could lean against its warm body, providing the kind of physical comfort that spoke to needs deeper than language could reach. As Jessica continued to observe, she became aware of subtle changes in the hospital environment itself. The usual nighttime sounds seemed muted, as if the building was holding its breath to avoid disturbing the extraordinary interaction taking place in room 314. Even the fluorescent light seemed to glow more softly, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a sanctuary than a medical facility. The mother bear remained in the hallway, but Jessica noticed that her attention wasn't focused solely on her cub's activities. The large animal seemed to be monitoring the entire wing, as if she understood that her presence in the hospital required vigilance and care. Occasionally, she would turn her head toward other rooms, and Jessica wondered if the bear was somehow sensing the pain and healing needs of the other children who slept nearby. Around 3:30 a.m., something unexpected happened that would change Jessica's understanding of the situation entirely. Connor Adams, a 12-year-old boy recovering from surgery in room 316, appeared in his doorway. Connor had been having difficulty sleeping due to pain and anxiety about his upcoming discharge, and he often wandered the hallway during the night hours when sleep eluded him. Jessica tensed, expecting Connor's appearance to frighten the bears or create a dangerous situation. Instead, the mother bear turned calmly toward the boy, studying him with the same gentle intelligence she had shown Jessica the night before. Connor froze in his doorway, his eyes wide with amazement rather than fear, as he took in the sight of the massive bear standing peacefully in the hospital corridor. "Are you real?" Connor whispered, his voice filled with awe rather than terror. The mother bear made a soft sound, almost like a gentle greeting, and Connor took a tentative step forward. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice growing stronger with wonder. "What are you doing here?" Jessica realized she was witnessing something that challenged every assumption about wild animals and human interaction. The mother bear was demonstrating a level of social intelligence and emotional awareness that seemed to transcend species boundaries. She appeared to recognize that Connor was a child in need of comfort, just as her cub had somehow identified Ethan as someone who required healing attention. The bear cub emerged from Ethan's room, drawn by Connor's voice, and Jessica watched in amazement as the small creature approached the older boy with the same gentle confidence it had shown with Ethan. Connor knelt down carefully, extending his hand for the cub to sniff, and within moments he was gently petting the small animal while tears of wonder streamed down his face. "I've never seen anything like this," Connor whispered to the cub. "I've been so scared about going home, about whether I'll be able to play sports again after my surgery. But you make me feel like everything might be okay." The cub responded with soft vocalizations that seemed perfectly timed to offer reassurance, and Jessica realized that she was witnessing the beginning of another healing connection. Ethan appeared in his doorway, drawn by the sound of voices in the hallway. Instead of being jealous or possessive about his special relationship with the bears, his face lit up with excitement at seeing another child experiencing the same wonder he had discovered. "Connor, aren't they amazing?" Ethan said, his voice stronger and more animated than Jessica had heard it since his arrival at the hospital. "How did you find them?" Connor asked, his attention divided between the bear cub and his fellow patient. "Or did they find you?" "I think they found me," Ethan replied thoughtfully. "I was feeling really sad and scared, and then they were just here. It's like they knew I needed them." He paused, looking at both bears with deep gratitude. "They're the best listeners I've ever met. They don't try to make me feel better with words. They just make me feel less alone." Jessica watched as the two boys sat together in the hallway, each taking turns interacting with the bear cub while the mother bear maintained her protective watch. The scene was so surreal that she had to remind herself this was actually happening within the sterile, regulated environment of a children's hospital. Yet, there was nothing chaotic or dangerous about the interaction. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if this was how healing was supposed to work. The conversation between the boys continued for nearly an hour, with each child sharing fears and hopes, while the bears provided silent but profound emotional support. Connor talked about his worry that his friends would treat him differently after his surgery, while Ethan shared his struggle with the guilt he sometimes felt about surviving the accident that had taken his parents. The bear cub moved between them, offering comfort to whoever seemed to need it most at any given moment. "Do you think they'll come back tomorrow night?" Connor asked as the first hints of dawn began to appear outside the hospital windows. "I hope so," Ethan replied. "But even if they don't, I think I'll remember how they made me feel. Like I'm not broken, just hurt, and hurt things can heal." The wisdom in his words struck Jessica as remarkable for a child his age, yet she realized that trauma often forced children to develop insights that surpassed their years. As the bears began to show signs of preparing to leave, both boys seemed to understand that their time together was ending. They said their goodbyes with a mixture of sadness and gratitude, each promising the other that they would talk more during the day. The bear cub nuzzled both children before rejoining its mother, and together they disappeared into the pre-dawn shadows with the same mysterious silence that had marked their arrival. Jessica remained hidden as the boys returned to their rooms, both visibly changed by their encounter with the bears. She could hear them settling back into their beds, but their whispered conversations continued for several more minutes as they processed what they had experienced together. The night shift was nearly over, but Jessica knew that the impact of what she had witnessed would extend far beyond the boundaries of a single evening. As she prepared to complete her final rounds before the day shift arrived, Jessica reflected on the profound transformation she had observed in both children. Ethan's journey from traumatic silence to emotional expression had continued, but now he also had a peer who understood something of what he was experiencing. Connor had found courage to face his own fears and uncertainties through connection with both the bears and his fellow patient. The bears' second visit had revealed new dimensions to their mysterious presence in the hospital. They weren't just providing comfort to a single traumatized child. They seemed to be responding to a broader need for healing that existed throughout the pediatric wing. Jessica began to wonder how many other children might benefit from similar encounters and whether the bears' visits would continue to expand their circle of influence. Dr. Carter arrived early again, drawn by reports of unusual activity during the night. This time, Jessica felt more prepared to discuss the children's remarkable progress, even if she couldn't fully explain the circumstances that had contributed to their healing. Both Ethan and Connor showed continued improvement in their psychological assessments, and their newfound friendship was providing additional support for their recovery processes. "Something extraordinary is happening with these children, Doctor," Carter observed as he reviewed their charts. "The speed of their emotional recovery is unlike anything I've seen in my years of practice. Whatever therapeutic intervention is taking place during the night shift is proving remarkably effective." Jessica nodded, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, healing happens in ways that medical textbooks don't describe, Doctor." Carter: "These children are finding strength and hope through connections that transcend conventional treatment approaches." She paused, studying his reaction. "Perhaps the most important thing is to support their progress rather than trying to analyze every aspect of how it's occurring." As Jessica prepared to leave at the end of her shift, she knew that she would return the following evening with even greater anticipation. The bears' visits were establishing a pattern that suggested they would continue, and she was beginning to understand that she was witnessing something far more significant than isolated incidents of animal-human interaction. This was the beginning of a healing phenomenon that had the potential to transform not just individual children, but the entire understanding of what was possible within the walls of Riverside Children's Hospital. The morning sun was fully risen as Jessica walked to her car, but her mind remained focused on the gentle mysteries that unfolded in the darkness. She carried with her the image of two young boys finding courage and connection through their encounter with wild creatures who had somehow become agents of healing. Tonight, she would be ready to observe and protect whatever magic was taking root in the pediatric wing, knowing that she was witnessing something that would change her understanding of healing forever. Word spread through Riverside Children's Hospital in the way that extraordinary news always does, quietly at first, then with growing momentum as more people witnessed what seemed impossible. By the third night, Jessica Brooks was no longer the only staff member who knew about the bears' mysterious visits. Dr. Logan Carter had begun staying late, positioning himself strategically to observe the phenomena that was transforming his young patients in ways that medical science couldn't explain. The pediatric wing had taken on an atmosphere of gentle anticipation as evening approached. Children who had been withdrawn and silent were now asking their daytime nurses when the special visitors might return. Parents, who had grown accustomed to their children's fear of the dark hospital corridors, were amazed to find them eagerly awaiting bedtime, hoping for another encounter with the gentle creatures who had somehow found their way into their healing journey. Lily Morgan, a 7-year-old girl recovering from a serious respiratory infection in room 310, had been the next child to encounter the bears. Her breathing difficulties had made sleep nearly impossible, and she had spent most nights sitting up in bed, struggling with each breath and fighting the panic that came with feeling like she couldn't get enough air. But on the third night of the bear's visits, the small cub had somehow sensed her distress and had positioned itself beside her bed in a way that seemed to regulate her breathing through some form of sympathetic rhythm. Jessica had watched in amazement as Lily's panicked gasping gradually synchronized with the cub's calm, steady breathing pattern. The child's oxygen levels, which had been fluctuating dangerously throughout her stay, stabilized for the first time since her admission. The mother bear had remained in the doorway, her presence somehow conveying a sense of safety that allowed Lily to relax into the kind of deep, healing sleep that had eluded her for days. "They breathe like a song," Lily had whispered to Jessica the following morning, her voice still weak but filled with wonder. "When I felt scared about not being able to breathe, the little bear showed me how to make my breathing match theirs. It was like learning a new kind of music, but with air instead of notes." The poetic nature of the child's description had moved Jessica to tears, recognizing that Lily had discovered something profound about the connection between emotional state and physical healing. Dr. Carter had been documenting these remarkable recoveries with the methodical precision of a researcher, but also with the wonder of someone witnessing phenomena that challenged everything he thought he understood about pediatric medicine. Ethan Marshall's progress continued to accelerate, with the boy now engaging in group therapy sessions and expressing interest in activities he had ignored since his arrival. Connor Adams had regained confidence in his physical abilities and was looking forward to his discharge with excitement rather than anxiety. The bears' fourth visit brought an expansion of their influence that surprised even Jessica, who had begun to anticipate their growing impact on the children's wing. Haley Dawson, a 9-year-old girl who had been admitted for treatment of severe anxiety following a traumatic incident at school, had been hiding under her bed when the bears arrived. Her fear of strangers and new situations had made her treatment extremely challenging, as she refused to interact with medical staff or participate in any therapeutic activities. The bear cub had somehow sensed Haley's presence beneath the bed and had approached with extraordinary gentleness, lying down on the floor beside the bed frame and making soft sounds that seemed designed to communicate safety rather than threat. For nearly an hour, the cub had remained motionless on the floor, allowing Haley to observe from her hiding place and gradually overcome her fear through patient, non-threatening presence. When Haley finally emerged from beneath the bed, she moved with the cautious curiosity of someone discovering that the world might not be as dangerous as she had believed. The cub had allowed her to approach at her own pace, never making sudden movements or demands for interaction. By the time the bears prepared to leave, Haley was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the cub, gently stroking its fur while tears of relief streamed down her face. "I forgot that some things could be gentle," Haley had confided to Jessica the next day, her voice still quiet, but no longer filled with the terror that had characterized her earlier interactions. "The scary things that happened to me made me think everything was dangerous, but the bears showed me that some creatures only want to help. Maybe some people are like that too." The transformation in Haley's perspective had opened the door to breakthrough progress in her therapy sessions. She began to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined dangers, developing coping strategies that allowed her to engage with the world around her instead of hiding from it. Dr. Carter noted that her progress in 4 days exceeded what they typically expected to see in weeks of traditional treatment. Jacob Bennett, an 11-year-old boy who had been struggling with the effects of chemotherapy for bone cancer, became the 5th child to experience the bear's healing presence. Jacob's treatment had left him weak and nauseated, but more challenging than the physical symptoms was his growing belief that he was becoming a burden to his family and friends. The isolation that came with his illness had convinced him that he was better off pushing people away rather than allowing them to see him in his weakened state. The bears had found Jacob during one of his darkest nights, when pain and medication had left him feeling disconnected from everything that had once brought him joy. The mother bear had done something unprecedented during this visit, actually entering Jacob's room and positioning herself where the boy could lean against her massive, warm body. The comfort provided by this physical connection had allowed Jacob to release emotions he had been holding inside for months. "I thought being sick made me different from everyone else," Jacob had whispered into the mother bear's fur, his words barely audible but filled with profound pain. "I thought it made me less than I used to be, like I wasn't worth caring about anymore." The bear had responded with gentle rumbling sounds that seemed to vibrate through her chest and into Jacob's body, creating a form of communication that transcended language. Jessica had watched from the doorway as Jacob poured out his fears about dying, about leaving his family behind, about the possibility that his suffering might be meaningless. The mother bear had listened to every word with the patience of someone who understood that healing sometimes required the expression of our deepest fears before hope could take root again. When Jacob finally fell asleep against the bear's side, his face showed a peace that had been absent since his diagnosis. The impact of that night's encounter had been immediately apparent in Jacob's interactions with his medical team and family. He began asking questions about his treatment instead of passively accepting procedures, and he started making plans for activities he wanted to pursue during his recovery periods. The shift from resignation to active engagement in his healing process had amazed everyone involved in his care. Dr. Carter had begun staying at the hospital most nights, documenting the bear's visits and their effects on the children. His initial skepticism had given way to scientific fascination as he witnessed consistent patterns of accelerated emotional and physical healing that defied conventional medical explanations. He had started reaching out to colleagues at other institutions, trying to find similar cases or research that might help explain what was happening at Riverside Children's Hospital. What we're witnessing challenges fundamental assumptions about the healing process, Doctor. Carter had confided to Jessica during one of their late-night conversations. These children are recovering from trauma and illness at rates that shouldn't be possible according to everything I learned in medical school. Yet the evidence is undeniable, and the improvements are sustained rather than temporary. Jessica had begun to understand that her role had evolved beyond that of a night nurse into something like a guardian of the extraordinary healing process taking place in the pediatric wing. She found herself protecting the bear's visits from potential interference, ensuring that their presence remained undisturbed by well-meaning but potentially disruptive hospital protocols. She had become an advocate for a form of medicine that existed outside traditional frameworks, but produced results that spoke for themselves. The bear's visits had established a rhythm that the children began to anticipate and depend upon. Not every child encountered them directly, but even those who only heard stories from their fellow patients seemed to benefit from the hope and wonder that permeated the wing during the nighttime hours. The atmosphere of the entire floor had shifted from one of medical necessity to something that felt more like a sanctuary where healing could unfold according to its own natural timeline. Savannah Reed, a 6-year-old girl who had been admitted after a severe allergic reaction, became the 6th child to experience direct contact with the bears. Savannah's reaction had left her with temporary vision problems that were expected to resolve, but had created significant anxiety about her ability to navigate the world safely. The uncertainty about her visual recovery had made her clingy and fearful, reluctant to move around her room or participate in activities that had once brought her joy. The bear cub had approached Savannah with particular gentleness, seeming to understand that her visual limitations required different forms of communication and comfort. Instead of relying on visual cues, the cub had used sound and touch to establish connection, allowing Savannah to experience safety and companionship through senses that weren't compromised by her temporary condition. "The little bear taught me that I can still know things even when I can't see them clearly," Savannah had explained to her parents the following day, her voice filled with newfound confidence. "I can feel kindness and hear gentleness, and those things are just as real as seeing. Maybe even more real." Her parents had been amazed by the philosophical depth of their young daughter's insights, and by her renewed willingness to engage with her environment, despite her visual challenges. The bear's influence had begun extending beyond individual healing to create connections between the children that strengthened their collective resilience. Ethan and Connor had become close friends, supporting each other through the challenges of recovery and discharge planning. Lily and Haley had discovered shared interest in art and music, collaborating on creative projects that helped both girls process their experiences and express their healing journey. Jacob had taken on a mentoring role with some of the younger children, sharing strategies for coping with medical procedures and finding hope during difficult treatments. His own transformation from despair to engagement had made him a powerful example for other children facing serious illnesses. Savannah had become an advocate for other children with temporary or permanent disabilities, demonstrating that limitations didn't have to define someone's capacity for joy and connection. Dr. Carter had begun documenting not just individual recoveries, but the emergence of what he termed therapeutic community within the pediatric wing. The children were supporting each other's healing in ways that complemented and enhanced their medical treatment, creating a network of peer support that accelerated recovery for everyone involved. The Bears had somehow catalyzed the formation of this healing community through their mysterious visits and the profound connections they facilitated. As the second week of the Bears' visits began, Jessica realized that the phenomenon had grown beyond anything she could have imagined when she first encountered the mother bear and her cub in the hospital corridor. What had started as an isolated incident involving one traumatized child had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of the pediatric wing's approach to healing and recovery. The hospital administration had begun to take notice of the remarkable recovery rates and positive outcomes being achieved in the children's wing, though they remained unaware of the unusual catalyst behind these improvements. Dr. Carter had been careful in his reporting, focusing on the measurable outcomes rather than the unexplainable circumstances that had contributed to them. He understood that protecting the Bears' visits was essential to preserving their healing influence. Jessica had started each night shift with a sense of anticipation and responsibility, knowing that she was witnessing something that would likely never be fully understood or replicated. The Bears continued to arrive with the same mysterious precision, somehow knowing which children needed their presence most urgently, and how to provide exactly the form of comfort and connection that would facilitate healing. The mother bear's wisdom seemed to guide their visits, ensuring that her cub's interactions remained safe and beneficial for all involved. Jessica had observed the adult bear's careful assessment of each situation, her protective vigilance, and her apparent ability to sense the emotional and physical needs of the human children who had become part of their extended care. As she prepared for another night of observation and protection, Jessica reflected on how the Bears' presence had changed not just the children they visited, but everyone who witnessed their gentle influence. The nursing staff had become more attuned to the emotional needs of their patients, recognizing that healing involved more than medical procedures and medication schedules. The doctors had begun incorporating discussions of hope, connection, and emotional well-being into their treatment plans. The Bears had somehow reminded everyone involved that healing was a holistic process that engaged the heart and spirit as well as the body. Their visits had created space for wonder and mystery within the clinical environment of the hospital, demonstrating that some of the most powerful therapeutic interventions couldn't be prescribed or scheduled, but emerged from the deeper connections that bind all living beings together. The night was approaching, and with it would come another opportunity to witness the gentle magic that had transformed Riverside Children's Hospital into a place where healing happened in ways that challenged every conventional understanding of medicine and recovery. Jessica knew that she was privileged to observe and protect something extraordinary, something that would remain with her long after the Bears eventually returned to whatever wild place had originally called them home. The Bears' 7th visit brought an unexpected development that would test everyone's understanding of the boundaries between wild and domestic, natural and supernatural. Michael Hayes, the 10-year-old boy battling leukemia, had been having an especially difficult week as his treatment intensified in preparation for a crucial phase of his recovery. The chemotherapy had left him weak and disoriented, and he had been experiencing vivid dreams that blurred the line between sleep and waking consciousness. When the Bears arrived that night, Michael was in a state of semi-consciousness, caught between the effects of his medication and the natural sleep his body desperately needed for healing. The bear cub approached his bed with unusual purpose, and instead of simply providing comfort through presence, the small creature began what could only be described as a healing ritual that defied every rational explanation Jessica could construct. The cub positioned itself at the foot of Michael's bed and began making rhythmic sounds that seemed to synchronize with the boy's labored breathing. As Jessica watched in amazement, Michael's vital signs, which had been erratic and concerning throughout the day, began to stabilize in response to the cub's vocalizations. His breathing deepened and became more regular, his heart rate settled into a steady rhythm, and the tension that had been evident in his face and posture began to release. The mother bear entered the room and took a position beside her cub, adding her own deep, resonant sounds to the healing symphony they were creating together. The combination of their vocalizations produced a frequency that seemed to resonate through Michael's body, and Jessica could see measurable changes in his condition as the session continued. His color improved, his breathing became effortless, and he settled into the kind of restorative sleep that his medical team had been hoping to achieve through the pharmaceutical intervention. Dr. Carter, who had been monitoring Michael's condition closely due to concerns about his response to treatment, arrived to find the boy sleeping peacefully with vital signs that were better than they had been in days. The Bears had completed their healing work and departed before his arrival, but the evidence of their intervention was unmistakable in Michael's improved condition and the sense of peace that permeated his room. "This is medically impossible, Doctor," Carter had whispered to Jessica as they reviewed Michael's overnight monitoring data. "His white cell count has improved, his inflammation markers have decreased, and his overall condition has stabilized in ways that should have taken weeks to achieve." He paused, studying the data with the confusion of someone whose scientific training was being challenged by undeniable evidence. Jessica had learned to navigate these conversations with careful honesty, acknowledging the miraculous nature of the children's recoveries, while protecting the source of their healing from potential interference. "Sometimes healing happens in ways that our instruments can't measure or our textbooks can't explain," she had replied. "Perhaps the most important thing is that Michael is responding positively to whatever intervention occurred during the night." The Bears' 8th visit had brought them to Avery Johnson, the young girl who was preparing for discharge after her appendectomy. Avery's physical recovery had proceeded normally, but she had developed significant anxiety about leaving the hospital and returning to normal activities. The safety and routine of the medical environment had become comforting to her, and the prospect of returning to the unpredictable world outside the hospital walls had created a new form of trauma that was delaying her discharge. The bear cub had approached Avery with the gentle confidence that had characterized all of its interactions with the children, but this time its presence seemed designed to encourage courage rather than provide comfort. The small creature had engaged Avery in what appeared to be a form of play, encouraging her to move around her room and engage in activities that demonstrated her physical readiness to leave the hospital. Through patient encouragement and gentle persistence, the cub had helped Avery rediscover her natural resilience and adventurous spirit. By the end of their encounter, the girl was laughing and moving with the confidence that had been characteristic of her personality before her illness. The fear of leaving the hospital had been replaced by excitement about returning to her family and friends, and she was discharged the following day with enthusiasm rather than anxiety. The pattern of healing that had emerged through the bear's visits was becoming clear to Jessica and Dr. Carter, even as the mechanism behind it remained mysterious. Each child received exactly the form of intervention they needed most, whether it was comfort for trauma, courage for fear, hope for despair, or physical healing for illness. The bears seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human suffering and an ability to provide precisely the remedy that would restore balance and promote recovery. As the bear's influence continued to expand throughout the pediatric wing, Jessica began to understand that she was witnessing something that transcended individual healing encounters. The presence of these wild creatures in the sterile environment of the hospital was creating a bridge between the natural world and the artificial constructs of modern medicine, reminding everyone involved that healing was ultimately a natural process that could be supported but not controlled by human intervention. The children who had encountered the bears were forming a special community within the larger hospital environment, united by their shared experience of something extraordinary and transformative. They supported each other through the challenges of treatment and recovery, drawing strength from their collective understanding that healing could come from unexpected sources and take forms that defied conventional explanation. Dr. Carter had begun incorporating elements of what he termed environmental healing into his treatment protocols, recognizing that the physical and emotional environment of recovery was as important as medication and procedures. He had started advocating for changes in hospital policy that would create more opportunities for natural healing influences, though he remained careful not to reveal the specific catalyst that had inspired these innovations. Jessica's role had evolved into something like a guardian of sacred space, protecting the conditions that allowed the bears' healing work to continue, while ensuring that their presence remained undisturbed by the well-meaning but potentially disruptive protocols of institutional medicine. She had become an advocate for a form of healthcare that honored mystery and welcomed healing influences that couldn't be quantified or controlled. The bears' 9th visit had brought an unexpected challenge that would test everyone's commitment to protecting their healing presence. A new administrator had been assigned to the pediatric wing, someone who was focused on efficiency and protocol compliance rather than patient outcomes and innovative approaches to care. This administrator had begun asking questions about the unusual recovery rates and the changes in standard procedures that Dr. Carter had been implementing. Jessica had realized that the bears' visits were at risk of discovery and potential interference from hospital security or administrative oversight. The delicate balance that had allowed their healing work to continue depended on maintaining the privacy and protection that had characterized their presence from the beginning. Any attempt to study, document, or control their visits would likely drive them away and end the remarkable healing phenomenon that had transformed so many young lives. The mother bear seemed to sense the changing dynamics within the hospital environment, and her behavior during the 9th visit showed signs of increased caution and vigilance. She spent more time assessing the safety of each situation before allowing her cub to interact with the children, and she positioned herself where she could quickly respond to any potential threats to their safety or mission. Despite these challenges, the bears continued their healing work with the same gentle dedication that had characterized their previous visits. The cub provided comfort to a new patient who had just arrived after a traumatic accident, helped a young boy overcome his fear of medical procedures, and offered companionship to a girl who was struggling with the loneliness of extended hospitalization. Jessica had begun developing strategies to protect the bears' visits from potential discovery, coordinating with Dr. Carter to ensure that their presence remained hidden from administrative oversight while continuing to document the positive outcomes of their healing influence. They had become co-conspirators in preserving something precious and transformative that existed outside the boundaries of conventional medical practice. The 10th visit had brought a profound realization about the true nature of the bears' mission at Riverside Children's Hospital. As Jessica observed their interactions with the children, she began to understand that their presence was not random or accidental, but part of a larger pattern of healing that connected all living beings in ways that human understanding was only beginning to recognize. The bears were not just providing comfort or therapy to individual children. They were teaching everyone involved about the fundamental interconnectedness of all life and the healing power that emerged from recognizing and honoring those connections. Their visits had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the children they touched directly, influencing the entire culture of the pediatric wing and inspiring new approaches to healing that integrated natural wisdom with medical science. As Jessica prepared for what she sensed might be one of the final visits in this extraordinary series of healing encounters, she carried with her a deep sense of gratitude for the privilege of witnessing something that had challenged every assumption she had held about the boundaries between human and animal, natural and artificial, possible and impossible. The bears had shown her that healing was ultimately about connection, compassion, and the willingness to remain open to possibilities that transcended conventional understanding. The night was quiet as Jessica began her rounds, but the anticipation in the air was palpable. The children who had experienced the bear's healing presence were sleeping peacefully, their recovery processes accelerated by encounters that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Those who had not yet been visited maintained hope that their turn would come, while those preparing for discharge carried with them the knowledge that healing could come from the most unexpected sources. Dr. Carter had positioned himself for another night of observation, his scientific curiosity balanced by his growing understanding that some phenomena were meant to be experienced rather than explained. Together, he and Jessica had become guardians of a healing mystery that had transformed their understanding of medicine, recovery, and the profound connections that existed between all living beings. As the clock approached the familiar hour when the bears typically arrived, Jessica felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness, sensing that the extraordinary series of visits that had transformed Riverside Children's Hospital was approaching its natural conclusion. The healing work that had begun with one traumatized child had expanded to touch dozens of young lives, creating a legacy of hope and wonder that would continue long after the bears returned to their wild home. The sound of soft footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of the bears for what Jessica somehow knew would be their final visit to the pediatric wing. The mother bear and her cub moved through the hallways with the same purposeful grace that had characterized all of their previous encounters, but there was something different in their demeanor tonight. A sense of completion and farewell that spoke to the conclusion of their healing mission. They visited each room where they had previously provided comfort and healing, as if saying goodbye to the children who had become part of their extended family through shared experiences of pain and recovery. In each brief encounter, they seemed to be offering a final gift of reassurance and strength, ensuring that the healing they had facilitated would continue long after their departure. Ethan Marshall, the first child to experience their healing presence, was awake and waiting when they reached his room. The transformation in the boy was remarkable. Where once there had been a silent, traumatized child, now there was a young person filled with resilience and hope, ready to face the future with courage drawn from the knowledge that healing was always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. "Thank you for finding me when I was lost," Ethan whispered to the bear cub as it approached his bed one final time. "You taught me that love doesn't disappear just because people do, and that there are always helpers in the world, even when we can't see them at first." The cub nuzzled against Ethan's hand, and in that gentle touch was conveyed a lifetime of wisdom about resilience, hope, and the healing power of connection. As the bears prepared to leave a Riverside Children's Hospital for the final time, Jessica felt a profound sense of completion and transformation. She had witnessed something that would change her understanding of healing forever. Something that had reminded her that the most powerful medicine often came not from pharmacies or medical procedures, but from the connections that bound all living beings together in a web of mutual care and support. The mother bear paused at the end of the corridor and looked back at Jessica with eyes that seemed to convey gratitude and blessing. In that moment of connection, Jessica understood that she had been chosen to witness and protect something sacred, something that would continue to influence her work and her understanding of what was possible in the realm of healing and hope. As the bears disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, they left behind a pediatric wing that had been fundamentally transformed by their presence. The children who had experienced their healing touch would carry that experience with them throughout their lives, knowing that healing could come from the most unexpected sources and that they were part of a larger community of beings who cared for each other across the boundaries of species and understanding. Dr. Carter and Jessica stood together in the quiet corridor, processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed and protected over the past weeks. They had been privileged to observe a form of healing that challenged every conventional understanding of medicine and recovery, yet had produced results that spoke to the deepest truths about the nature of wellness and the power of compassionate connection. The legacy of the bears' visits would continue to influence the culture and practices of Riverside Children's Hospital long after their departure. The children they had touched would become advocates for approaches to healing that honored mystery and welcomed influences that couldn't be quantified or controlled. The medical staff who had witnessed their work would carry forward a deeper understanding of the holistic nature of recovery and the importance of creating environments where healing could unfold according to its own natural wisdom. Jessica knew that she would never again see healing in quite the same way, having witnessed the profound transformation that could occur when the barriers between human and animal, natural and artificial, possible and impossible, were temporarily dissolved in service of something greater than any individual understanding. The bears had shown her that healing was ultimately about connection, compassion, and the willingness to remain open to possibilities that transcended conventional boundaries. As the morning sun began to rise over Riverside Children's Hospital, it illuminated a pediatric wing that had been forever changed by the gentle presence of two bears who had somehow found their way into the sterile corridors of modern medicine, and reminded everyone they touched that healing was ultimately a natural process that could be supported by love, patience, and the recognition that all living beings were connected in ways that defied explanation but demanded respect and wonder. The children began to wake to a new day, carrying within them the seeds of healing that had been planted during their encounters with the mysterious visitors who had taught them that recovery was possible, that they were not alone in their struggles, and that the world contained sources of comfort and strength that could appear when they were needed most, even in the most unlikely places and through the most unexpected messengers.